Welcome to 100 Yards of Football this morning. I'm your host, Vincent Turner. If you like the video today, please come in and share it. Today, I got a very special video. As you know, the 2021 NFL Draft ended on Saturday. So, what would be an outstanding way to pay homage to one of the guys that really started to play at a high level at the defensive end position? His name is Deacon Jones out of Mississippi Valley State. So if you like the video today, please come in and share it. Let me start about Mr. Deacon Jones. What an outstanding football player that played 14 years in the National Football League. 14th round draft pick in the 1961 draft with the LA Rams. And man, was he a football player. But this is what I like about Deacon Jones. He was at South Carolina State in 1958. Was kicked out of South Carolina State because he was one of the youngest protesters in the civil rights movement back in the late 50s and late 60s. He ended up in Mississippi Valley State. Back in 1961, he wasn't even on the NFL draft radar. But what happened, there was some scouts down there in Enabina, Mississippi, and they came down there to scout some running backs. But they kept seeing this defensive end out of Eatonville, Florida, outrun the running backs. And at his size, they say, man, this guy is really a special athlete. Well, the LA Rams took a flyer on him in 1961. And he was the 14th round selection, as I just mentioned. But boy, was he a football player. He went on and played for the Los Angeles Rams for 10 years. And he played on, in my opinion, the greatest defensive line of all time, the first enforcer. Lamar Lundy out of Purdue University. Marilyn Olsen out of Utah State. And Roosevelt Gray out of Penn State. They wreaked havoc for 10 years. But let me get back on Mr. Deacon Jones. What made him special? I'm going to give you my great report on this great, phenomenal football player. Man, the handwork was an A+. The speed, sideline to sideline, A+. The quickness, A+. The power to come at the quarterback and rush, A+. And the instincts were off the charts, A+. Another thing about Deacon Jones is this right here. He invented the hand slap. And what I mean by that, if you go back and look at his old films, you saw him raise that right hand. And he was always hitting the offensive lineman at the top of the head. And you know what he contributed that to? He said the hand slap was quickness of the hands and length of the arms. Man, he was a special player. But I'm not going to tell you how special he was. I'm going to tell you right now his overall accolades in the league. 8-time Pro Bowler, 5-time All-Pro. Oh, Lord, have mercy. NFL Defensive Player of the Year in 1967 and 1968. They didn't keep records of the sacks back then during that era, but now in the modern era, they did go back, and a lot of great sports historians went back and graded each Deacon Jones film from his playing days back then. And think about this. If they was keeping the sack record now, this will be his numbers. 176 sacks in 191 games. 26 sacks in 1967. 24 sacks in 1968. NFL Defensive Player of the Year in 67 and 68. This young man was an outstanding football player. But you know what? There was a lot of good people said a lot of great things about him. His head coach, George Allen, said he's the greatest defensive player that ever played the game. Fran Tarkenton from the University of Georgia, by way of the New York Giants and the Minnesota Vikings, said he was not a dirty player. One of the cleanest players that played the game. And if you're talking about royalty, in my opinion, you look at the Los Angeles Rams football history and all the great players that had come through there. Right now, we got Aaron Donald. In the 80s, it was Eric Dickerson. In the 60s and 70s, it was Mr. Jones' teammate, Roman Gabriel, Marshall Faulk, and Kurt Warner. This man, in my opinion, is the greatest LA Ram of all time. He was a special, special football player. Voted into the Hall of Fame in 1980. So my homage to Deacon Jones, man, you was the greatest defensive end that played this game. And you started it for Richard Dent, Reggie White, Howie Long, oh my God, Michael Strahan. You set the foundation of how the defensive end position supposed to be played at a high level. Another thing about Deacon Jones, he only missed 5 games in his career. Out of 191 career games, back then when you didn't have modern medicine, you didn't have all the technology to get you back on the field, the guy only missed 5 games. And I said again, go back to the sacks he had. In his career, if we taking record, he had 176 sacks in 191 games. And think about this. 3 times in his career, he had over 20 sacks in the season. And that was on a 14-game schedule. That's special. So, Deacon Jones, this is what I have to say about you. And this is what the people say about Deacon Jones and himself. I'm probably the toughest football player you know, and the toughest guy that's ever been on the field. But I'm clean, I'm mean, and I don't have no marks on my body. And you can check with any sport that I'm the only guy that walked away from the game with no marks. So that being said, Deacon Jones was the baddest and the boldest player to play in the National Football League. And my homage to him is at the end of the day with David Deacon Jones is like the great musician out of Denton, Texas, Sly and the Family Stone. All I need is a drummer. I'm going to add a little guitar. Well, Deacon Jones added all that flavor back in the 60s. And you better take notice because this young man's the greatest defensive end that ever played in the National Football League. Thank you today for watching 100 Yards of Football. I'm your host, Vincent Turner. And to my man, David Deacon Jones, and one other tidbit. He went to Mississippi Valley State. Pound for pound, just another gentleman that might have been the greatest football player that ever played in the league, Jerry Rice. They are alumni of that little small school down in Ena Bena, Mississippi Valley State. Thank you today. Be blessed for the rest of the week. I'm your host, Vincent Turner.